the sector. So with today's webinar, this is the first webinar that we're hosting in 2021. We had an incredible webinar program last year that saw thousands of people attending our webinars. We really were able to significantly expand the scope in terms of those engaged in bioenergy, and it has really created a much bigger breadth of engagement for us in terms of industries and groups that we're now working with, which is fantastic. If anyone has any suggestions on webinar topics that they would like to see us pushing forward with, please just let us know. We're always up for suggestions and hoping to be running a webinar every couple of weeks. I think we have another one taking place in 2 weeks. It's around risk and insurance for projects in the bioenergy space. I'd strongly encourage you to be checking that one out and registering for that free webinar as well. In terms of housekeeping for today, can I ask that everybody has their microphones on mute and turns off their camera? It can just, except for the speakers. It can just be a little bit distracting if you are accidentally on camera and then walking around the house and brushing your teeth and doing those things. So if you accidentally get ejected from the call, it means you were probably doing one of those things and we could all see it, and we didn't want you to be embarrassed for too much longer. So can I ask everyone to do that? Can we save questions for the end? And sorry, in terms of questions will all be delivered and managed by the amazing Henry Anning at the end. So if you have questions, please pop them into the chat function as the session is going on. As you think of them, pop them into that chat area, and Henry will be able to go through that area and make sure that those questions are either addressed through session or responded to by other people who are actually on the call as well, who might be experts in that particular area and can jump in and give a quick answer to those. This webinar is also being recorded, so it will be available and sent out to everybody afterwards. Feel free to forward it on. It will be available on our YouTube channel for people to be able to look at as well. So please feel free to watch it, use it, pass it on, however you would like to. That's it for me. I feel like I've probably taken up way too much time. I'd like to thank Henry for all of his time being a board member of Bioenergy Australia, but also assisting us in terms of delivering this particular webinar. Henry is the CEO of Resources Energy Systems, and he is now going to take over and introduce the speakers and get this show on the road. So thank you, everyone, and I'll talk to you soon.
Thanks, Shahana, and thanks to the Bioenergy team for pulling together the session today. Shahana's done all the housekeeping, so questions in the comments, and we'll get through what we can at the end. You know, the speakers are all on strict instruction to keep to their time, so we can cover some questions at the end. I think, you know, the attendance today shows the level of interest in this topic, and anyone that hasn't been sort of noticing everything happening in the electricity sector generally and in bioenergy over the last 5 to 10 years has obviously not been reading much media. So I think having a topic like what is the role of bioenergy when there are major reviews and decisions and changes and policies sort of under place, you know, it's the right time to do it. We've got a fantastic lineup of speakers, and you know, I will be quiet and let them get going and share their knowledge. So in terms of the speakers today, we're not going to do detailed introductions. You know, these days you can always find people's bios on LinkedIn. You can find more detailed information. So we have James Reynolds, General Manager at AEMO, Keith Lovegrove, Director at ITP Thermal, Mengyu Lee, Postdoctoral Research Associate at ISA, University of Sydney, Patrick Lim, Commercial Group Manager, LMS Energy, and Bernie Heron, Senior Project Engineer at MFS Sugar. And each of them brings a different perspective to this question, and we've intentionally structured it to cover a range of different sort of theoretical, policy and practical day-to-day sort of operational views in relation to the current electricity grid and where it may go over the next 5, 10, 20 years. So without any further distraction from me, I'm very happy to hand over to James and look forward to the presentations today. Thank you.
Thanks, Henry. If I just get started, James Reynolds from GM of Strategy at AEMO. The intention is just to take you through some high-level slides outlining or documenting our perspectives out of the ISP and out of some of our planning reports, etc., associated with the future electricity supply, and then getting into some detail around the existing reforms that are currently under review, under management with the ESB process, and then just considering some aspects associated with how bioenergy may actually be able to play a role. Jess, if you just want to jump to the next slide, please. Please excuse me if you've seen this slide before. It's often used by AEMO, but it just effectively takes people through our view of how things may change out of the ISP planning and modelling, and it looks at changes out to 2040. So I think in the last sort of 10 years, we've had about 5,000 megawatts worth of thermal generation retire, and we're looking, and at that same time, we've had about 10 gigawatts worth of renewable energy come in. So out to 2040, we're expecting most of the coal-fired fleet, or a substantial proportion of it, to retire, as well as a substantial role for distributed energy generation. So technically, subject to which sort of scenario you look at in the ISP, we're looking at somewhere between doubling or even a tripling of that DER resource. And we're not just looking at DER from the perspective of rooftop solar, but we're also looking at the supporting of residential scale batteries in terms of that mix. In terms of keeping the system whole or meeting future demand based on the demand forecasts that are in the ISP, we're looking at least 26 gigawatts worth of new large-scale renewable energy to replace the retiring, particularly the retiring coal-fired generation fleet, subject to a lot of the assumptions that are in there. Jess, if you just go to the next slide. This is the central scenario. It's effectively a least cost optimal development path, which, if you're interested, there's the ISP planning documents that go through in a lot of detail in terms of what that scenario is and what we consider to be an optimal development path. I think probably the critical part here is the extent to which the coal-fired fleet retires, both in terms of the brown coal fleet in the Latrobe Valley, as well as then the brown coal fleet, the black coal fleet that exists in New South Wales and also Queensland. There is quite detailed information on those retirements within the ISP in terms of actually identifying which plant is expected to retire in terms of the timing. Now, AEMO doesn't actually make any judgment on the timings. They're announced, or that's information that actually comes out of the operators of those thermal power stations. We take that information and we put it in to not just the ISP but also the ESU, and we don't put too much value judgment around it in terms of those announcements. I think the critical part here is the growth in both solar, your distributed PV, but also your wind, particularly as you move out towards 2040, as those coal-fired fleets retire. A critical part, and probably worth mentioning, particularly for people on the call, is that a lot of the outcomes you see from the development pathway, as well as the different scenarios that we look at. So there's a central scenario, there's a step change scenario, and then there's a slow change scenario. Now they're effectively driven out of the inputs and assumptions books. So I'm pretty certain most of the people on the call will be aware that a lot of the outcome that you see is driven by those input assumptions that are put into the ISP model. And we're currently in a process on looking at input assumptions for the 2022 ISP, and there is a section in there on biomass and bioenergy as a contributor to that model. So I sort of recommend that people have a look at our website and look at that assumptions book. And if you've got any questions or any sort of further information that you'd like to seek, there's a consultation process that the Nicola Falcone's group with Craig, I think it's Craig, in terms of running. So if you've got any information there that you think that might be useful, that we should be aware of. Just joined into that consultation process. So it has things in there like heat rates, capital costs, fuel charges, etc. Fuel costs that exist or that we're making for bioenergy. If you just go down to the next slide, and look, there's probably enough people on the call to realise that the reform agenda for the NEM is very, very significant at present. And AEMO is working in the Energy Security Board with the AMC as well as the AER, and obviously the chair, Kerry Schott, in terms of looking at how the existing NEM market design and market reform can be changed or redesigned to accommodate the energy transition to a lower emissions setting. So in terms of now there's a series of papers that the ESB released late in the year. They're all significant documents, but they go into quite a bit of detail as to some of the different options that are being investigated across these different work streams or work packages. The first stream here is effectively the two-sided markets. And look, probably the key feature here is that at present, in terms of the NEM, we forecast demand and then we move the large-scale generation fleet or the registered generation fleet around to actually meet that demand. We don't actually, it's more of an equals function within our systems and within how we schedule and operate the market. It's envisioned that with the substantial penetration of DER, particularly supported by batteries, and particularly out of once we get through reforms such as 5-minute settlements as well as global settlements, there will be a case where demand is actually live, and that demand may have the possibility to actually bid and rebid itself in. So I think probably a lot of the thinking around demand has always been around, if the price is high, demand will come off. I think in time we can see a future where there is so much solar within the system that there's a potential that demand may bid to be paid to actually come on, to actually soak up that solar generation that's sitting on the system. So the two-sided markets reform piece is really looking at how that may work and how that may be designed, and how that actually may enable and extract value from those resources. Similarly, the DER integration piece is really around trying to capture the extent of DER that's actually within the system. So at the moment, there's roughly 2.5 million solar PV installations that are actually in the system, and it's growing at, I think it's around about 26,000 per month, subject to which source you use. So effectively, we're really looking at trying to how we actually enable that particular resource, bearing in mind that it is actually located in the distribution part of the network or the low voltage, medium voltage part of the network. And at present, we have substantive visibility over the large-scale TNSP system and the interconnectors with the generators, but a lot of the DER assets sit with the distribution networks. So there's a roadmap of work that needs to be done around how we actually understand the level of DER within the system, the distribution system, working with the DNSPs, so that we can actually look to enable DER integration, but in a way that does not pose reliability or security or voltage risks to the distribution itself. Pardon me. And then the other pieces of work is the essential system services. There's a head mechanisms which is designed to sort of provide opportunities particularly for dispatchable energy to be able to be firm or much firmer within the system. And then there's some reform work going around the resource adequacy mechanisms. So when you hear discussions around system strength, inertia, primary frequency response, secondary frequency response, or capacity markets or forward markets, that particular bundle of market design work is being taken care of within this particular work stream, as is looking at resource adequacy mechanisms. So we're looking at options around the RRO and the triggering of the RRO in terms of making the obligation in terms of firmer access. And then the last work stream is really around transmission access and coordination of generation and transmission. There's probably a few people on the call that recall COGATI and the nature of that particular market design piece, and that's really around investigating how you actually provide different or better price signals for generation, as well as how you actually work through that transmission access, bearing in mind the renewable energy zones that are identified in the ISP will require substantive investments in transmission to make work. So there's a fairly big coordination piece to make sure that as much as possible that we actually look to keep the least cost solutions within the system to continue to make energy affordable. And then the last piece there is looking at the aging thermal generation strategy, and that's really around trying to understand the nature of exit and what impact it has on the system, and that we actually have some preparedness, whether that's keeping some dispatchable generation in the system longer, or allowing it to exit at a more timely basis, so the industry actually has time to respond in terms of the investment profiles that they actually undertake. Jess, if you just like to go down to the next slide.
James, about 2 minutes, please.
Perfect. Look, I'll skip through this. I think, given the people that are on the call, you probably know this better than what I do. Jess, if you just go down to the next slide. So look, in terms of our perspectives, and this is a position that we're working through internally. That's not necessarily AEMO's public view at the present time, but we see there being opportunity for bioenergy, whether it's in engines or it's small scale turbines, whether it's biogas or biodiesel. We do see it being, given the scale, some of the scalability issues with biofuels or bioenergy, we're looking at more of at a local energy supply or backup, and whether it can actually support electricity network supports in terms of the increasing penetration of solar PV, and being probably in terms of an operating regime, something that actually comes in post a battery not being post a battery discharging. In terms of some of the existing reforms, there's arrangements looking at market ancillary services. So that's where effectively smaller scaled generation kit can actually provide market ancillary type services in terms of FCAS. There's also the virtual power plant trials that we're actually working with the DNSPs on, and they provide essentially quite good technical and economic building blocks where there is the commercial opportunity for a smaller scale bioenergy type asset. They might be able to take advantage of those particular existing registration arrangements and some of those reforms that are going on. You can see them on the AMC website. In terms of the broader piece, which is the post-2025 piece, similar style, micro style assets in terms of distribution system and potentially in the transmission system, around being able to fill in or support the DER integration, but then also potentially provide some of those essential system services, particularly where you have bioenergy being able to turn an engine or to turn a turbine, because they provide different types of ancillary type services that help the electricity system stay whole. So I'll probably leave it at that, Henry.
No, thanks, James. Really good sort of overview and introduction. I know there's a couple of questions. There's some great slides in there, and as Shahana said, it's being recorded, so the slides will be available through that. I think it also provides a good introduction and segue to the next speaker, as well as some of the latter speakers, LMS and MSF as current operators of larger and smaller scale bioenergy in the market currently and looking to the future. So Keith, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Henry. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear.
Okay, and are my slides up okay?
Yes, it is.
All right, so I'm doing this from Adobe. We couldn't get the PowerPoint transitions to work, so no transitions today. I'd like to make a few points about sort of calling on a study that we did for ARENA that was published at the end of 2018, so a couple of years ago now, but I think the principles and findings of it are still worth repeating at this point here. And really the message is that bioenergy is very much a key dispatchable renewable electricity option, and we should think of it as dispatchable. I think historically the bioenergy industry has often used the phrase that we are the baseload renewable, but I think we've just about reached a consensus now that baseload is a rather old world and outdated concept. I mean, the old world was a demand that went through a daily cycle, and we had obviously a base load, a minimum load through a 24-hour period, but really the base load concept came in because we adopted large coal-fired power stations as base load generators. They were a technology really tailored to run continuously, and they were the cheapest source of generation. So we took the base load generators as the cheapest generation, and then the more expensive and more flexible gas as the thing that could follow the varying demand in a sort of peaking intermediate way. But the new world, as I think we're all recognising, is that it's variable renewables, the wind and the PV, which is the cheapest megawatt hours. So to the extent that we can easily accommodate that generation, and it is the cheapest, we would obviously want to take it. But we need to still follow a variable demand. So we need dispatchable things, and the central scenario that James just showed right out to 2050, we have, let's say, a decrease in the overall amount of dispatchability, but it still ends up at about 30% of the capacity. And I think the ISP, as he also said, is suggesting that we'll need somewhere between 6 and 19 gigawatts of dispatchable capacity. But I'd like to add to the language, first of all, that when we talk about the penetration of renewables, it's the variable renewables that's in a sense the issue. It's the wind and the PV. The dispatchable renewables are the things that will do the backup. And the other thing I think we're probably all conscious of on this meeting is that, you know, with Joe Biden's new administration entering the fray, we more or less have a complete consensus globally now that we must fully decarbonise by 2050. So there really is no room for, well, there's certainly no room for new coal, and very, very, very limited room indeed for new gas. So the dispatchable gap needs to be renewable. Just to sort of repeat the points that appear in the 2020 ISP, well, there's all that retirement at 63% of the coal, but this graph in the 2020 version I hadn't seen before myself, and it's quite interesting that they've done a graph where they've added the gas retirements as well. And they are substantial because some of our combined cycle plants have been around for quite a while. Key point is somewhere between 6 to 19 gigawatts. Obviously, it's not a precise number, quite rightly so, because the issue with the dispatchable resources is, now that we've recognised that the variable generation is the cheapest per megawatt hour, it's not so much a question of how much of the dispatchable do we need. The issue is, what is the least cost mix? It's not about, well, dispatchable's harder and more expensive, we want the minimum of it. No, we want to choose a optimal least cost mix. What do dispatchable generators do? Well, I think that's fairly obvious. I've put in bold there that sending out electricity when most needed on different timescales, and that ranges from the smoothing of the wind and PV on the literally minutes to half-hour type thing, to the extending into the evening peaks, targeting those peaks. But there's also the interesting point of, well, people will raise the idea of what do you do in the cloudy, windless week. And it does happen. It happens, every year. There'll be periods of a wind solar drought. What do you do about those periods? But then we have the system security things, and they seem to get a lot of discussion, I guess. And I guess they get the discussion because, for whatever historical reasons, the wind and PV, particularly the PV penetration, has grown enormously. to the point where suddenly the system security issues get discussed. But I would argue that if we address the resource adequacy issues and we make sure we've got a generation mix that will meet demand at all times, that the very attributes of the dispatchable renewables, and this is what the table's referring to here, and I've highlighted the final conversion attributes and what they do, and our bioenergy friends have the option of steam turbo generators, gas turbines or gas engines, or indeed diesel engines. And these final conversion apparatus, by their very nature, provide inertia, synchronous generation, and even in some cases the ability to run the unit as a synchronous condenser. So historically, I would argue that the presence of dispatchable coal and gas has kind of meant that the ancillary services and the system security issues were sort of there in surplus by default. But if we move into a world of 100% renewables and we have a good mix with dispatchable renewable generators, we should pick up again these other benefits and essential aspects that we need. So quickly, some results from this study that we did for ARENA back in 2018. We looked at all the dispatchable renewable options. So just slightly different approach. There's often talk of, oh, well, we need storage, or as in storage of electricity. Well, our argument was, well, if you put wind or PV with the storage technologies, fine, that gives you a dispatchable renewable. But let's try to think of a way of comparing it with things like bioenergy, which are inherently dispatchable. We also looked at concentrating solar thermal power with thermal storage, geothermal. What we looked at were representative technologies that are ready to be installed at utility scale. They're done somewhere in the world at least. So in the bioenergy space, we looked at anaerobic digestion plus gas engines, combustion boilers plus steam turbines. There's other more advanced biomass approaches, so nothing precludes new and advanced technologies coming in, so it's representative is what we did. Now, a key part of what we did in this work, which I think was new and different to a lot of other studies, is that we developed cost models that were broken down into subsystems, and we thought of it as collection, initial conversion, storage, final conversion. What does that actually mean? Well, let me run you through a PV battery example. The collection subsystem is the PV farm. We get a cost model that is cost per megawatt of output of that. Initial conversion is the power conditioning that interfaces to the farm. The storage is, of course, the battery, but the cost per megawatt hour of storage capacity, it's effectively analogously the cells of the batteries. And then in the battery system, the final conversion is the inverter and the power electronics that interfaces to the grid, which we have a cost model, cost per megawatt of that capacity. So the really important thing here is that we think of the overall battery system, which is this storage plus final conversion, has two dependencies for its installed cost. And this really is central to the understanding. Now, when we take that to our bioenergy things, how do we choose to understand that? The anaerobic digestion, well, the collection it's really a waste. So we've just said it's waste at $0 a gigajoule. Our initial conversion is the digester. Our final conversion is the gas engine plus the generator with this cost parameter, but not to be neglected, and we went out of our way to estimate this, is the fact that the gas after digestion, even in the standard systems, there is a space above the digester that accumulates an hour or so of gas, but we can actually ask the question, well, what if we added volume to that and worked out what that costs? Well, we can actually do a cost estimate of adding gas accumulator at $12,000 per megawatt hour of heating value in the fuel. So that's the model for the anaerobic digestion. In the combustion boiler plus steam turbine case, we just looked at biomass at a couple of different prices, but fairly low priced, almost waste biomass, I guess, is assumed. It's more like $12 a gigajoule if we were looking at plantation wood chips, for example. We skipped the idea of the initial conversion, but we did think very seriously about the concept that if you're burning dry biomass in a boiler, you have a stockpile, and you can have a bigger stockpile or a smaller stockpile, basically a really big shed full of stuff. And that can be estimated and valued at $1 per megawatt thermal of storage. And this is a really key point. And then finally, the boiler plus the turbo generator with those parameters there. So I've got 4 slides now of LCOE results, fairly busy slides.
Keith, about 3 or 4 minutes, please.
Okay, thanks, Henry. This is for 1 hour duration of either storage or operation. So we're forcing our bioenergy people to run only 1 hour a day, which is a fairly silly thing and puts the LCOE right up. What you see is that 1 hour a day, a battery solution is the cheapest. You also see that the variable generation is the cheapest of all, so we bear that out. But you can see that for the dispatchable systems, there's various contributions that make up the LCOE, which is quite instructive. Now we change the duration, 6 hours. Suddenly our biomass anaerobic digestion is one of the most competitive of all at 6 hours already. As we go to 12 hours, the bioenergy things get better and better. Certainly, if you run them continuously, they have the lowest LCOE. Take the bioenergy results, put it on a different graph. It looks like this. Lowest LCOE when you run 24 hours a day. But if you look particularly at the anaerobic digestion thing, the idea that you add a gas accumulator and put in a bigger engine and run it less hours of a day, and the assumption here is, well, you only have a certain amount of material, you have a finite biomass resource, so how to get the most value out of it. You can run it at a much lower capacity factor without a huge increase in LCOE if you run it 3 to 5 hours a day. But we know that the peak periods when there's no sun and no wind, they are going to be essential things for resource adequacy, but that's expressed in the wholesale pool price at the moment. And we certainly know that if you take the highest price periods of an interval in a state like South Australia and average those, let's say the top 10% price points historically, they'll be worth considerably more than 2 or 3 times the annual average. So this speaks to the idea of rethinking bioenergy generators as strategic, flexible, peaking things designed from scratch to give the best return on investment that we can anticipate, but of course we never quite know what the future wholesale prices will be. Jumping ahead again through the, I said earlier on that there's the idea, well, what do you do of the week in which there's no sun and no wind? This is a fairly busy table, but if you just look at the marginal cost with each of those different approaches to dispatchability, if we had a system and then we said, I will add a megawatt hour of storage, what's the marginal amount I have to pay? And it turns out that a depot, a shed full of dry biomass is essentially by far the cheapest long-term energy store that you can contemplate. I mean, it takes up space and you have to worry about if it gets wet and spontaneous combustion. So it'll need managing, but it is by far the cheapest way of literally putting some energy away for a rainy day. Interestingly, underground hydrogen is the second cheapest. But if you look at the biogas one, the biogas is comparable to a pumped hydro system or a molten salt tank in a CSP plant. So all 3 of which are really quite affordable in terms of those wind, sun droughts. Okay, so the question is, what is a least cost mix? And I'm not saying this is it. In fact, I'm putting this up here to say, well, a little ad for my colleagues. ITP has an open source version of some software that purports to optimize these mixes. As James clearly said, it's incredibly sensitive to the input assumptions. So if you put in a high capital cost of a certain technology, run the model will tell you none of it will ever get built. So actually, when you look at these things and you look at the results in the current ISP, it doesn't actually have a line for bio in the generation mix. But when you see things like quite a large growing wedge of what was called dispatchable storage, I mean, essentially that's the market niche that bio can target. And at the end of the day, it's about project developers to get their prices down and compete with their relevant competition. And so for bio, it's not competing with PV, it's competing with pumped hydro. So conclude.
I'll have to wrap you up there.
Okay, wrap it up there. Bioenergy ticks the boxes: synchronous generation, inertia, fault current. Whilst the LCOEs are lower at continuous generation, cutting back the capacity factor increases the LCOE, but it slightly, but provides very competitive, fully flexible generation. Dry mass in a stockpile is the most cost-effective strategic reserve. But it all comes down to the market redesign, and James pointed out that the ESB is doing this at the moment. So we've got a consensus that the NEM rules at the moment do not lead to good construction choices, but we need to avoid traps. I mean, we're thinking about this, but what we don't want is new rules that lead to very short construction time things always being favoured because there's not enough warning to make investment decisions. The RET has caused all our renewables to sort of, the wind and PV to be built, but I've often advocated an idea where we could have a reinstated RET, but we have a multiplier which is proportional to pool price to encourage the dispatchable renewables, or even a dumb multiplier for peak periods. Okay, I'll stop there. Thanks, Henry. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, Keith. A lot of really interesting and valuable information there. So sorry to wrap you up at the end. Again, that work, arena-funded work of Keith's, is publicly available, and I'm sure Keith will take more detailed questions offline as needed. So, Meng, I'll hand over to you, and look forward to your presentation.
Yeah, thank you, Henry. So I assume everyone can see my screen, right?
Yes, it's up now and we can hear you.
Yep, so now we enter into the full screen mode, right?
Yes, that works.
Okay, yeah, perfect. So thank you very much for having this opportunity to share our latest findings of the role of biomass in a 100% renewable electricity supply in Australia. And this project is part of the NSW climate change project that is funded by DPI. So starting from 2020, we can all feel the huge impact that is happening because of COVID-19, and the pandemic is taking place in the shadow of a more long-lasting global crisis, climate change. Energy accounts for almost 2/3 of the global greenhouse gas emissions, and therefore its decarbonization remains as the heart for almost all solutions. And as a result, facing these two global crises, governments around the world are formulating stimulus packages and recovery plans that are trying to remain economic growth, create more jobs, and also meet the environmental goals. A recent IPCC report proposed multiple mitigation pathways to limit the global warming under 2 degrees, where renewables contributing from 70% to 90%, 97% in the global electricity generation, with bioenergy contributing from 10 to 40% in this primary energy supply. And one would ask why biomass is important, and this can be partially explained from the famous duck curve. So this curve shows the net load profile, where net load equals the total demand minus the electricity generated from PV wind, where we can see that from around 3 p.m. to 9 p.m., the total generation needed from electricity generated outside of PV wind could almost doubled within such short period of time. And those are crucial periods when generation from energy storage technologies or other dispatchable resources such as hydro and biomass could play a role. And to tackle this big gap problem, actually different technologies, of course, have their own advantages and disadvantages. And considering the cost, energy storage, of course, are sometimes associated with a higher cost, and depending on the water availability, hydro have their own limitations, and biomass definitely has its unique role to play in this in providing those peak load generation. And I will then explain how biomass is important from two kinds of view. So first is how biomass is important in transition scenarios, and followed by its role under 100% renewable grid. So for doing such analysis, we developed a clean grid around 4 years ago, and trying to look at trying to model Australian electricity grid on MATLAB. And clean grid is basically composed of 3 submodels: the resource generation, the demand model, and the resource demand balancing model. And the basic logic deployed here is try to minimize levelized cost of electricity that includes fixed capital, variable, and transmission costs. And the constraints here are firstly, the hourly generation is limited by its resource potential, and the secondly, the total generation should equal the total demand. And the clean grid deployed high resolution GIS data, and it also includes different types of technologies, including PV, wind, hydro, biomass, CSP, electric vehicles, storage, etc. And up to now, we have 12 peer-reviewed publications using clean grid to analyze Australia grid. So in the first set of scenarios, I will show how biomass is important in those transmission scenarios. And to model this, we adopted a parameter called common price that is ranging from 0 to $990 per ton to examine how fossil fuels are gradually excluded in the generation mix. And figure below shows an comparison of the bidding price for different technologies. So here, starting from, for example, common price of $1 per ton, we can see that coal's bidding price is around $50 per megawatt hour. And with the increasing carbon price, coal's fossil, the bidding price for fossil fuels are increasing, and you can see the curves of fossil fuels are moving right to this figure. And here are the results where I distinguish the total installed capacity and generation under different carbon price settings. So starting from carbon price of 0, it represents the current BAU scenario where we have around 68 gigawatt installed capacity and total generation of 260 terawatt hour. And with the carbon price increasing, we can see that the total installed capacity and generation are decreasing for fossil fuels. And apparently, the generation from renewables are increasing. And notably, we can see that coal is phased out when carbon price is set at 100, and gas is further excluded when biomass reached 500. And starting from 500, the generation mix enters into 100% renewable grid. And if we further focus on biomass, we can see that, well, actually its installed capacity is gradually increased, but its generation share is increased more from around only 100% in the BAU scenario to around 10% in the 100 renewable grid scenarios. And in the following, we will do more simulations with the biomass under 100% Australian renewable grid. To do this, we adopted 2 parameters to describe different assumptions of the biomass technology. So the first parameter is the biomass capacity multiple. It represents how, if the capacity of biomass could be expanded, and here we limit its expansion to up to 15 times. Comparing to the current installed capacity of 1.7 gigawatt. And the other parameter we varied here is the cost assumption. So we assume biomass cost to be 0.8 to 4, comparing to the current cost levels. And those...
Sorry, Ming, about 3 minutes, please.
Thank you. And those aforementioned 2 parameters generated in total more than 200 scenarios, which we then plot in this territory plot. So in this territory plot, we can see 3 axes. There are generations from biomass, CSP, and others. And for each point here represents 1 scenario. And for example, the red here representing the situation based on the current biomass cost, and here it represents the generation from biomass equals 0.1 and the CSP of around 40%, and the rest to be around 50%. So in this territory plot, the sum of 3 axes should be 1. And depending on the cost and expansion levels, with more generation from either biomass or CSP, we can see that the total capacity is going down to, say, 70 or to, say, 100 gigawatt under different scenarios. And the right-hand figure here shows the comparison of different scenarios with and without biomass under the current cost levels. So without biomass, we could obtain a total installed capacity of around 160 gigawatt, and only with 5 gigawatt biomass being installed, the total system capacity is decreased by almost 20 gigawatt. This further shows the importance of biomass in the 100% renewable grid. And for those simulations that were published last year on the biomass Bioenergy, where you can find more details. And so this is the last of my slide, trying to show the hourly generation scenarios in a typical summer and winter week. So depending on the cost assumption, biomass could be served as baseload throughout the year, or only be deployed during the typical winter week when there is no sun or wind. And apparently we can see that like normally in the summer week, we have abundant solar resources, and generation from biomass is in general limited. And in typical winter times, when limited resource is available from solar and wind, biomass can like wrapped up to its full capacity within a short time, and then provide the peak load generation. So this is the end of my presentation, and thanks for your attention. And any comments are welcome to contact me through my email address below. Thank you.
Thanks, Mengyu. Really appreciate that. And I do sort of encourage people to look into the published paper. It's definitely worth reading. So with that, I'll hand over to Patrick.
Thanks, Henry. Alrighty, is that all good to go?
Yep, can see and hear you in the presentation's up.
Perfect. So thanks for everyone for dialing in and tuning in today. My name is Patrick Lim. I'm the Commercial Group Manager here at LMS Energy. My role here is to manage our portfolio of around 65 megawatts of landfill bioenergy and solar assets. And we generate electricity, LGCs and ACCUs. We don't have a lot of time today, so I'd like to give a brief background of LMS, the positive outcomes we've been able to achieve within the electricity and carbon markets, and highlight some of the difficulties we foresee in the NEM and their impacts, and then explore at a high level future opportunities for bioenergy generators. So in the 80s, LMS Energy established its first landfill biogas project by utilising the biogas as a fuel source at a nearby brick kiln. And from there, we went on to pioneer biomethane injection and electricity generation into the respective local grids in the 90s. Since then, LMS continues to innovate within industry, being the first to install solar panels on landfill ground and capping. And we continue to look towards other innovative bioenergy solutions into the future. We're a vertically integrated bioenergy company. We've got our own dedicated resource recovery, engineering and manufacturing groups, and we market the electricity, green and carbon products ourselves. It's important to note that LMS does not own or operate landfills. We are strictly focused on the biogas recovery from the waste. To give you a brief overview, we're currently operating on 50 landfills throughout Australia and New Zealand, with 28 landfill bioenergy facilities across Australia. As I said, 65 megawatts of installed capacity, and that generates 24/7 renewable energy. The remaining sites currently flare the biogas until such time power generation is deemed feasible and sustainable. And in 2021, we expect to expand generation capacities at 6 of our sites and develop 4 new flaring projects. So how does it work? Well, we collect and utilize the landfill biogas. To do that, we must drill into the deposited waste, actively extract the methane generated from the decomposing waste below. This biogas is then piped to our bioenergy facilities, and at some sites, this can actually be a number of kilometres. It's then utilised by one of our reciprocating engines to generate renewable electricity, or put through one of our high efficiency flares, which destroys the methane. And by using our IP, we're able to maximise the amount of gas captured at site. So we actually achieve industry-leading gas capture rates. And to do this, it requires significant upfront and ongoing capital investment into our people, technology and operations. And at a high gas capture rate, the environmental impact from landfill is reduced and can actually result in landfills which are emissions neutral. The result of our investment in maximised biogas capture in 2020, for example, is the generation of 450 gigawatt hours of renewable energy and more than 3.7 million tonnes of CO2 equivalent prevented from being released into the atmosphere. And this makes LMS the single largest contributor of carbon abatement under the ERF. And if we can put this into context, it's the same as powering 75,000 homes and removing 1.2 million cars from the road, which is approximately all the passenger vehicles in South Australia. By virtue of the technology utilised at these sites, the mere operation of the generators provides inertia, voltage control, and fault ride-through capabilities, and that's directly into the distribution networks that they're located in. These grid stabilising attributes are important in light of the significant increase in the penetration of variable renewable energy, as we've all heard, and within the grid. And I'll touch on this a little bit later in a future slide. I guess further benefits can be witnessed at sites that are located at network fringes, where our generators absorb a lot of voltage variations, and it's so stabilising and increasing the reliability to the surrounding households and businesses, and thus kind of saving customers the cost of expensive network augmentations, which may have been required had our plant not been built. And I suppose with an estimated 120 megawatts of existing landfill bioenergy generation within the NEM, the combined contribution to network stability should not be ignored or forgotten. And if appropriate market signals were present, we see there being opportunity for additional 250 megawatts to be developed. So currently, as we've all heard, the NEM is in a state of transition as regulators and policymakers in the private sector seek to decarbonise the electricity sector while ensuring the reliability of supply. As a result, there are a number of programs and initiatives on the go, which will have different impacts on how the market operates and what services it rewards, and the key milestone being the outcome of the ESB's post-2025 market design. And this contemplates future markets in system security, inertia, and capacity. To add to that, we've got the Australian Energy Market Commission, which has around 30 open rule changes it is considering. AEMO has its integrated system plan, and New South Wales, for example, has its electricity strategy. And if that's not enough, we can throw in bi-metal settlement, demand response, VPPs, and battery storage. So a lot of change, a lot of transition at the moment. And why all of this? Well, it's as we've heard, it's partly in response to the growing VRE, variable renewable energy penetration, and expected decline in traditional thermal generation. That looks something like this. 57 gigawatts of new VRE to enter the system, represented on the graph on the right, and approximately 20 gigawatts of coal and gas generation to exit the bottom left graph. And the impact of the increased VRE into the grid can also be seen through effect on wholesale prices. In 2020, we saw VRE placing significant downwards pressure on prices throughout the year. And although this slide indicates positive pricing, we saw a significant increase in negative price events throughout the NEM. So in 2020, we had over 3,500 intervals which settled below $0, and this represented a 166% increase from 2019. Sorry. And we expect to see this trend continue in future years. And it's important to note that many VRE generators seek to curtail their generation at negative price intervals, and LMS is actually no exception to this. So although the increase VRE and decreased wholesale prices are positive for consumers, energy consumers, and Australia's carbon emission reduction goals, it does result in some complications for AEMO as market operator. And that can be seen through this graph, whereby the number of directions for security and reliability have increased. So SA, for instance, these directions generally translate into directing gas-powered generators to turn on, and in 2020, this cost increased to 49 million, which is 91% higher than the year before. So where does this leave bioenergy facilities in the NEM? In the current climate, there is undoubtedly uncertainty. as to the continuation of these generators into the future. And this means that the benefits they contribute, such as inertia voltage control and a significant amount of carbon abatement, is actually at risk. And this is because of the lack of co-benefit recognition, increased negative prices where plants shut down or incur costs to generate, the significant capital required to continue these generators operating, and the absence of reward for producing flexible, firmed, renewable energy. And if we come back to the raft of changes proposed with the goal of a smooth transition towards a more secure and reliable system, I think there are many opportunities for bioenergy facilities to contribute to the solution, but it's really only if there's a market design that supports these benefits. So I think it's therefore extremely important for key regulatory bodies and the ESB to not forget the positive outcomes produced by bioenergy facilities, and ensure that the designing of future markets allows the opportunity for these facilities to participate. To wrap things up, we suggest that the consideration of embedded generation from bioenergy be considered in the same light as distributed energy resources, and that will allow operators such as LMS to aggregate plant, enabling participation in future markets. I think further integration and accessibility to contribute to the provision of FCAS would also be welcomed. And really, if this can be achieved, we see the opportunity for bioenergy industry to grow. And we believe that it can unlock 250 megawatts of additional flexible renewable energy, which predominantly would be synchronous and will also contribute significant carbon abatement at the same time. That's it for me. Thank you. Happy to answer any questions as they come through.
Thanks, Patrick. Very much appreciated. Repeating at the beginning, feel free to put questions down in the chat bar. Speakers who have already finished, feel free to review some of those and respond as appropriate to particularly technical ones that we might not cover at the end. And I'll hand over to Bernie to talk through his presentation. Thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Hang on, let me not give myself a technical challenge. Can you see my screen yet? Hang on.
Not yet, Bernie. We can see and hear you, but cannot see your screen yet.
Oh, how's that? Is that any better?
Not up for me yet. Oh, here it comes. Yep, we can see your whole screen, including sort of the video, but not focus on the presentation yet.
Hang on, where is it? I can't even see it. It says you are presenting.
We can see your whole screen. If you go to your PowerPoint, I think that will work.
Oh. All right. How's that?
Yep.
Okay. Hang on. I just got to get this one. I need some practice. All right. Can you see that?
Yep, that's working. Thank you.
All right. Okay. Well, just a little bit about myself. You'll see in the bio that I started out life as the senior project engineer for the Green Energy Power Plant project. But in more recent history, I've taken on the role of operational manager of the mill to sort of try and land the project and look after the sugar processing as well. Okay, so if we just, what I'll take you through is just the tableland opportunity, the project scope, the journey, which reads quite like a horror story, and then the recommendations, and the comments and questions will come afterwards with Henry facilitating. Okay, so if you look at the tableland mill opportunity, we started out life being able to, with a much lower pressure power plant, where the key focus was just about supporting sugar operations in the crushing season, where we could put up to 2.5 megawatts of export out the door through the 2022 to 25-week crushing season. Particularly, it was predominantly through the winter months, which is June through to December. Back in 2015, 2016, we actually, MSF Sugar, which is, we looked at commencing transforming their business into just a raw sugar manufacturing, and it's really commercial pressures are driving that to a manufacture of high value products that originate from cane, and electricity, ethanol, particle board, yeast, food, additives, pharmaceuticals, cosmetics and plastics are the sort of suite that are available. We're still very much in the first step of that, which is back in the electricity one there. So we were looking to make the most of the fact that cane's a very efficient biomass generator, and being able to add a bit more value from what we could do from the biomass residue that we get from sugar processing operations. So the project, really what the project entailed, it entailed having to upgrade the grid interconnection, a new high pressure boiler, a new steam turbine generator, a standby diesel generator, and then the auxiliary systems to support all that. So that, I mean, I don't think there'll be anything startling with anyone that knows what it takes to have a reasonable cogen facility around. You need things like demon plants, deaerators and all that as you start to work into the higher pressures and temperatures to be a reliable contributor. I know this slide's a little bit busy, but I really was just focusing on just the grid interconnection. Because we are embedded into the ergon distribution system, where we are up on just on the other side of the Great Divide, on 11 kilometres west of Walkerman, if you know the Atherton Tablelands in Queensland. So there was a single base 66 kV switch yard, and then that was connected through overheads into the interconnection substation and then cabled into the plant. So that's sort of a view of where we are. And if you see that the new boiler and turbine hall, while the site was a brownfield site, we actually had a bit of real estate. So the actual build of the new plant was in relatively, well, it was, we were able to release part of the site to the principal contractor, so that they could build in a greenfield portion on the brownfield site to make it functional. So the one thing that it's probably nothing particularly new, but for the Australian cane industry, there's a lot more hardware involved, and that's to get the most out of the gas recovery. So we don't throw energy up the stack like we historically do. And because the price of water up in the tablelands is quite valuable, we actually elected to put an electrostatic precipitator for the gas scrubbing gear to keep our water footprint down. So it's the first of its type in Australia in the cane industry, but they have been installed in other parts of the world. So there's a whole new learning curve of how to operate those without having them blow up if you don't manage the combustible buildup in them. Okay, so if I just take you through quickly where we started, there's a bit of detail. I'll just leave it when the slides are presented. I've really put a lot of the detail down on the slides so that they stand alone. So we basically went from a 19 bar boiler up to an 87 bar boiler, and we went from a 7 megawatt back pressure turbine to a 24 megawatt extraction condensing turbine. And and with the grid connection upgrade, we needed to go from being able to put potentially up to about 3 MVA out the door to being able to put 20 MVA out the door so that we could export our 17 megawatts. The commercial reality of the project, it's not a pretty picture. The contracted practical completion scope with the date was actually 17th of July 2018, and we did grant practical completion on the 1st of December 2020, which is 27 months late, even though we're still a little way, we still haven't got to full noise on the plant. So if I just go through the timeline, and that's really what I focused on this presentation. The contract award was actually late October. Well, it was early October 2016. The contract was signed. The construction commenced in May. It was quite an ambitious construction schedule, with the major components coming out of India, and there was a direct shipment with a roll-on, roll-off activity into Cairns back in November 2017. The boiler was supplied from ThyssenKrupp India. The turbine was supplied through ThyssenKrupp India, sourced from Triveni India, with a WEG alternator as part of the package. There were significant construction delays, and it really was around, I suppose, quality control, manufacturing schedule, and the critical path material challenges not being what happened in reality wasn't quite optimized, and it takes quite a lot of effort to try and manage offshore deliveries of that magnitude. And there was some significant material damage in transit. Effectively, the ESP components had to be re-straightened before we could even install the ESP on site. Well, I mean, it was a headache for the principal contractor, and they certainly paid a heavy price for it. The operational commissioning commenced in November 2018, so we didn't even come close to making the practical completion date of July 8, 2018, with the boiler alkali ball out, which is the first step in cleaning up all the starting that. The grid connection upgrade was placed in service basically in early December. We were able to commence the alkali ball out powered from the original 7 megawatt lower pressure boiler from a power source point of view. Just when we had finished sort of doing our steam blows and we thought we had everything ready to go, we were 4 days short of wanting to commence our first scheduled R2 testing. Back in April 2019, we had a very bad air heater fire on the shutdown that we did immediately prior to that, where there had been a lot of combustibles had built up within the air heater, and it ignited and got hot enough to actually get us to a metal fire condition. It resulted in a sort of 6 month delay while we had to rebuild the air heaters. And when there's sort of 7.9 kilometers worth of air heater tubes, people don't have those in their back pockets to allow the rebuild of those air heaters. It was quite a massive effort to actually do that. Steam generation was able to recommence in September 2019, and that we then could start our steam dumping to clean the return condensate systems, which we thought we were just about ready to do, and the R2 testing could commenced in October 2019.
Randy, 3 or 4 minutes, please.
Okay.
Thank you.
All right. The first batch of whole point 1 and whole point 2 identified a whole heap of issues around the fact that we didn't what we had the parameters we'd based the modeling on weren't the actual ones we were finding when we started testing, to the point in December 19 we basically had to required to update the R1 model, and that took through to May 2020. Okay, I'll just keep speeding through this one. So I'll just, if people just, when they see this PowerPoint, then they just catch up with the timelines, because I really want to focus on the recommendations, because those that come after us, I really want them to pay attention to the challenges that it causes when your model, your measurements don't match your model. It causes a whole heap of pain and a lot of commercial pressure. So if you go through that, we sort of went through the crush and with an updated model and started testing there. We had to get special permission to be able to run without the due diligence being completed, because we were at risk of spontaneous combustion and we didn't have enough storage of bagasse. space available for this, because we'd actually accumulated 2 more years of surplus bagasse than we expected, because we thought the project would have been going 2 years sooner. So we were operating at an interim level to keep, I suppose, the head above water in terms of the space we had available to store bagasse. Our purchase power agreement with Ergon expired at the end of 2020, and when we went out to the market, we selected a different PPA that required us to change our generator registration status. And then we found we sort of ran into a sort of obstacle in the fact that we couldn't, the AEMO couldn't change our generation registration status until due diligence has been completed. And that was still in process, and that impasse is being worked on right now. And then we still got the rest of the things to do there. So if people would just catch up with the timeline, otherwise I'll be well over the time. If we just go through to the recommendations, sorry, I'll just go through there. Okay. Now, so undertaking an electrical generation project in Australia, I would definitely say, is not for the faint-hearted. And engage an expert who understands the whole registration process and is familiar with the NEM rule version that you have to work with. And that's absolutely critical to do that, to help guide you through the process. Ensure that the factory and sectum's tested. I mean, if I did this project over again, these are the things I would have paid a lot more attention to up front. Make sure that you actually factory acceptance test it. You actually measure all the machine parameters so that when you actually have them available for your modelling, and then the risk of not having them being right is much reduced. There's a lot of pressure on for the modelling experts available within Australia that understand the environment, and so getting access to them is not assured, and it's very time. If they're not available, it actually takes a lot of time. And that was one of the issues why it took us 6 months to get the updated model from December 2019 to May 2020. Things take a lot longer than you expect. There are significant network strength issues, and that's really because the market is so much in transition, and it's not always that easy to find out about them before they impact your project. So that's where that technical expert if he's situationally aware, would help you manage those risks in terms of what you're going through if you encounter that. I found AEMO sort of many departments that operate independent of each other, so don't assume they actually talk to each other, because I really found that you end up having to give them this very similar information multiple times to each department, and you just got to bear with it. That's part of the process. The generator registration decision makers, and that's because the AEMO is responsible for the electrical market, they want to walk away from any registration process with accurate models that they can take to the bank, and that's really their key focus from what I could see, and I could understand why. And it's really vital that your R2 test results match your R1 model predictions. So understand the risk of completing commissioning, which is this project is really much, I think I went in undercooked with that, is if you need to export power to be able to commission the plant, and you then have to, go through the R1, R2 process to be able to ramp up to that. It's really important that you understand just how to tiptoe through the minefield on that one without setting off too many mines and actually causing a lot of schedule delays. And like, while you may think a 24 megawatt synchronous generator in a very large system wouldn't have the ability to adversely affect the network, that really doesn't guarantee permission to proceed to commissioning if there's technical challenges are raised through the R1, R2 process.
30 seconds, Benny, please.
Okay, I think that's about me done anyway, Henry. I mean, I just and then I just said common sense is not that common, but just be warned with that. So I mean, that's